Let's move on to look at the perspective guides, which we can use to help us draw in perspective. I'll load the perspective room template, and the objects in this room were drawn in a 2-point perspective. We can enable the perspective guides in several different ways. There is a perspective guides tool in the toolbox. If you have the brush tool selected, perspective guides can be found in the stroke options. When the perspective guides tool is active, you can click on Advanced in the properties bar to open the perspective guides panel. You can enable and disable the guides here as well. I'll leave the perspective guides panel open. What I prefer is to use the shortcuts in my workspace to enable and disable mirror painting and perspective guide modes. When perspective guides are enabled, several guides appear on the canvas. We'll be able to see these guides better if we zoom out. If it's hard for you to see the guides, you can change the guide color and opacity. I'll turn the primary guides up to 100% so you can see them more easily. There are a few different modes to the guides that can be cycled through with my custom shortcut of P. We want this mode with the primary, horizon, and intermediate guides. I'll reduce the density of the intermediate guides to 25% to create fewer guidelines, and I'll make them a bit fainter than the primary guides. By default, the 2-point general composition preset is enabled. This has 2 vanishing points on either side. These guides line up perfectly with this artwork because this scene was created using this exact preset. The red line is your horizon line. This is your eye level as the observer of the painting. You can use this to make objects appear taller or shorter than the observer, or you can change the angle at which the observer is viewing the painting. The green guidelines converge at 1 or more vanishing points on the horizon line. The outer guides are the primary guides, and the intermediate guides are in between. The primary guides have circles on either end, which indicate where the guides converge at the vanishing points. As objects move into the distance, they get smaller and closer together until they eventually vanish. And as objects move closer toward you, they get bigger and more spaced apart. A scene can have multiple vanishing points. Most commonly, there are 1, 2, or 3 vanishing points in a scene, but some scenes may require more than that. The vanishing points can be moved horizontally or vertically to change the perspective. Typically, you'll want the horizon line to be straight, and the vanishing point should be spaced out far enough to avoid causing perspective distortion. Once you have set the vanishing points, you'll want to avoid moving them once you begin drawing. Otherwise, your perspective will become misaligned. I'll choose a different preset, and then reselect the 2-point general composition to reset the guides. The primary guides can be repositioned by dragging the larger center squares. You can move these around freely because they do not affect the position of the vanishing point. The 2 smaller squares on either side of the center square are used to rotate the guides. This will move the vanishing points, so be careful about doing this. We'll come back to why you might want to rotate these guides in a bit. I'll position one of the primary guides near the top of the dresser. I'll drag another one to the top side of the window, and I'll place the other 2 along the bottom edges of the rug. The divisions in between the primary guides are there to help you visualize the horizontal lines that converge at the vanishing points. Where they intersect, you get the impression of tiles, which can be useful for illustrating objects in perspective with the correct proportions. You can see that when I draw with perspective guides, my lines are forced into alignment based on the selected perspective. With the exception of vertical lines, if I try to make a line that is at a different angle, I cannot. If you keep getting lines that are going toward the wrong vanishing point, draw toward the correct vanishing point rather than away from it. If you want to stop drawing in perspective, while Align to Guides is enabled, you can hold down Shift, which will temporarily let you draw freeform. When you let go of Shift, you'll return to perspective drawing. You can also go to the Perspective Guides panel, or Properties, and uncheck Align to Guides. Now you'll be able to draw freeform until you enable alignment again. I've created a couple of custom keyboard shortcuts to make it easier to work with the perspective guides. I can show and hide the guides with P. Pressing this several times toggles through the different modes of guides. The first mode we'll look at is with the guides disabled. While you cannot see the guides, Align to Guides may still be enabled. The third mode shows the horizon line, the primary guides, and the intermediate guides. The fourth mode shows only the intermediate guides. I'll zoom out a bit and return to the primary guides. As I mentioned earlier, Each of the primary guides have rotation handles, which allow you to rotate the guide on the center square's axis. This will move the position of the vanishing points, so you probably want to avoid doing this unless you're trying to match the guides to the perspective in a scene. The vanishing point was already correct in this painting, but I've messed it up. Now if I draw something with this perspective, it doesn't match the perspective in the artwork. To match the guides to the perspective in this scene, we need to first move the horizon line to the horizon in the scene. If you cannot see the horizon in the scene, look for a perfectly horizontal line, like the one on the dresser or here on the plant. To align the vanishing point distances to the angles in the scene, I'll zoom in to where I can more easily see the handles on the guides. With my Perspective Guides tool selected, I'll drag one of the center squares of the primary guides onto a line in my composition that I know is aligned with the vanishing point. I'll center the guide right on one of the lines. Then I'll use the rotation handles to match the angle of the vanishing point. I'll be careful to align it perfectly with that edge, because even a small offset will throw off the perspective. I'll need to do that on the other side as well. I'll use one of the lines on the window to align my guide. By pulling away toward the vanishing point, that tends to work best. I'll need to align the other primary guides as well. Once I have placed the guides, I'll ensure that everything lines up correctly by drawing some lines in perspective. If the perspective is still not aligned, then go back and adjust the guides to get them closer. Try moving the guides to different vanishing point lines to further calibrate them. You may need to do this several times. It can be difficult to match the guides to the scene perfectly, but you should be able to get it close enough to still keep things pretty much in perspective. Ideally, you'll set your perspective guides first, before you ever do any painting. In that case, you don't have to worry too much about your guides becoming misaligned, unless you accidentally move the guides. Fortunately, you can create custom perspective guide presets to ensure that you can always restore the position of the guides. The 4 default presets are a good starting place, but you will probably want to modify them for each painting. Set the guides, and then choose Add to save them as a preset. Perspective Guide presets can only be saved with a Painter RIF file. The presets are not saved with your workspace, they are only saved with the document. I'll switch to the Perspective Presets template, and let's return to the Perspective Guides. Let's make sure that they're visible so we can try some of the other default presets. You may be familiar with 1-point standard horizon if you've ever driven down a road. The road converges at the vanishing point, which is in the center. The trees are larger and farther apart in the foreground, and smaller and closer together in the background. Here's an example of some of my artwork that utilizes a 1-point perspective. We've already seen what 2-point general composition can do. It works great for drawing architecture and interiors. 3-point top-down view adds a third vanishing point far below the horizon line. This is the kind of perspective you'd see if you were atop a tall building looking down at the city below. The other 2 vanishing points are on either side, similar to the 2-point perspective. I'm using the default position of the vanishing points, but you'd probably want to move the points out farther to reduce the perspective distortion that you see near the edges of the canvas. Here's another example of 3-point top-down, showing what you can accomplish using 3 or more vanishing points in a painting. 3-point worm's eye view is the opposite of the top-down view. Now you're a worm looking up at a child's building blocks. Again, this perspective preset is a bit too distorted for my liking, so you may want to separate the vanishing points a bit more. If you'd like to use more than 3 vanishing points in your painting, you can create a preset for each of the perspectives, and then toggle between them.